My name is Alastair Reid. I'm the digital editor here, and I'm very much playing just a kind of a hosting role here. I will be fielding any questions. I'll be adding some links into the chat box as well that relate to the examples which our excellent panelists are going to be giving. In terms of First Draft, for those people who aren't aware, First Draft is a non-profit organization which was set up in 2015, and our mission is very much to support journalists and the wider public in issues around information disorder. So how social media and technology has really disrupted how many of us get information, how information is shared, and trying to understand and in some ways hopefully fix some of the problems that come up there. Today we're going to be talking about inauthentic and coordinated behavior online. There's often conversations around bots or around botnets is something that comes up in online conversations quite a lot, but things aren't always as they seem. So we have three excellent and experienced panelists to discuss the issue today. We've got Carlotta Dotto, who's a senior data journalist here at First Draft. Seb Cubbon is a research analyst here. And Stefano Cresci as well, who is at the Institute for Informatics and Telematics at the Italian National Research Council in Pisa, all of whom have done lots of work around this area and have got lots of insights to share. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say. I hope you are as well. If you do have questions or comments, please share them in the chat box. There's an option to click all panelists and attendees, just so everyone can see and hear that. And we will deal with questions towards the end. And I will now hand over to the experts.
Thank you, Alastair. So now I'm just going to offer a very quick outline of what we're going to cover in this webinar. So Stefano and I will kick off by introducing and debating the concepts and definitions that are relevant to this topic. Secondly, Seb is going to go through several key indicators that can be spotted using basic manual and verification techniques and serve as a starting point to determine whether it may be worth carrying out further investigation on a given account or a network, and so on. Finally, we're going to move on to the more practical technical aspects of some of the more advanced tools and techniques. This will include some basic OSINT and data analysis and computational techniques that can help analyze coordinated and or inauthentic activity. So I just want to introduce very quickly this topic, saying that ever since disinformation became a worldwide threat in 2016, the word bots has grown around. From basically any elections that happened since then, any major news story worldwide, up to the coronavirus outbreak, bots have always been a hot topic. But more recently, since the pandemic began, new claims of automation are springing up almost daily around the world. And that was mainly the reason why we decided to pull this webinar together. Because even though it's a recurrent topic, there's still a lot of confusion around it. And while headlines may suggest how pervasive and seemingly easy to detect bots are, and botnets, in actuality, it is an incredibly complex process that frustrates attempts by the world's top academics. So first of all, there are no unique definitions of what automation means, and it's often more accurate to speak of broader dimensions such as coordination, manipulation, inauthenticity, which could be even more problematic to define. And therefore, because even in the field of bot detection, a lot of academics have different metrics and methods to define automation and coordination, and rarely agree on what these metrics and tools are, which makes it harder and harder to say something conclusively about this topic. So for example, between different studies that came out recently, some of them, a couple, attracted a lot of interest and came out with big numbers about automation within coronavirus narratives and even within the Black Lives Matter protest. And their methods have been the object of several debates. Stefano will tell us a bit more into details about all this disagreement in academia, but as we can see in the next slide, the platform themselves responded to some of them. Here, for example, we have the head of site integrity of Twitter, as well as the head of security policy of Facebook, pushing for more precaution in defining automation, linking to some of the platform's policies and reports. For example, Facebook defined bots as agents that, with a varying degree of automation, communicate on social media, whilst they define inauthentic behavior as the use of Facebook or Instagram to mislead people, and the coordinated inauthentic behavior as when groups of pages and people work together to mislead others about who they are and what they're doing. So saying that a bot is an account that relies fully or just partially on automation softwares reminds us that a bot is basically just a few lines of code written to carry out a task automatically. So this can be used by legit people for legit reasons. And before becoming synonymous with Russians and disinformation, they were quite innocuous to begin with. So they were used by companies and advertisers. They were used in journalism a lot, in many creative ways to do many useful things. So for example, in the next slide, you can see just a few lines of code that I used with Python to create a bot that basically retrieves coronavirus latest updates and tweet about them in real time. There are so many good examples about this. For example, the Washington Post, which used an in-house heliograph, which was an automated storytelling tool to increase local coverage, or the LA Time bot, which automatically takes data and if a quick report is above a certain size, writes a basic breaking news story, sparing a lot of time for a newsroom. But on the other hand, bots can indeed be problematic, and that is more about the content they push and how they push it rather than the software they use. So as we define the conceptual framework in the next slide, we want to stress how it is much more about the manipulation of traffic rather than whether the accounts are actually real or not. And this is a point that is really, really important to us. It's never a black and white thing. It is always on a scale. And something might be inauthentic, but not be automated. Something can be coordinated and not inauthentic. Often something that starts inorganically then become organic. So it's really problematic to use unique definitions. And this is why we must be careful of using the word bot or automation, because it could become problematic to always attribute suspicious behavior to bots, and you might overlook or just miss what actually aren't bots, such as groups of people that are paid, are involved in organic grassroots campaigning. And there's a lot of damage that they can do. So a network of accounts can manipulate the traffic to give extra exposure to a divisive topic or propaganda. They can increase disinformation about a pandemic, as we were just saying, making the public less likely to comply with scientifically informed government measures. And they can create distrust in institution and authority with the goal of spreading confusion and fear. So what is important for us as researchers in this field is to find variables that say, even though not conclusively, but with a relatively confidence, that this is a manipulation campaign, and to give an incentive to the platforms to do something, to take down suspicious activity, suspicious accounts, and when needed, to amend their policies. And just an additional point is that even we do find evidence of botnets, quantify their impact is really hard. It's hard to assess the effects and influence that trending hashtags and astroturfing campaigns have on politics and real life, and whether when a political party or a conspiracy group can get a message or an hashtag or a specific narrative to trend on Twitter, it then jumps automatically to other platforms such as Facebook or messaging apps, going a long way in controlling the political debate. So I will leave all of these questions open, and I will pass on Stefano Cresci, who is a great expert in this field. I'm going to ask him to explain a little bit better the evolution of bots and botnets, and why it is becoming increasingly complicated to identify these identities and quantify the extent of manipulation.
Thank you, Carlotta. Thank you, all of you, for having me here. Yeah, so I think Carlotta did a great job in explaining the reasons why bots and automation and coordination is important nowadays. Actually, it's a lot of years that researchers have been studying automation and how to detect automated behaviors. and things have changed quite a lot in all these years. So we started like 10 years ago with very simple accounts, very simple bots that were performing basic operations, basic tasks, and they were substantially spamming the same messages over and over again. Or other types of automated accounts were instead just being created for inflating the number of followers of a target account, like a public character that wanted to appear more popular on web platforms. So he was buying fake followers or fake retweets, that kind of stuff. And those accounts, they had a very simple thing to do, inflating the number of followers or repeatedly spamming the same message. And because of this, they were very simple, very simplistic. And in turn, it was very simple to detect them. So at that time, like 10 years ago, we could talk about a binary vision of automation, so bot or non-bot. But with the time, researcher published detection techniques, detection algorithms. So bot developers in turn became more clever, and they kind of tweaked the behavior of their accounts in order to evade being detected by published techniques. And so there was a kind of a vicious circle where bot developers were pushing out ever more sophisticated accounts, and the bot detectors tried to keep pace with them and to propose more complex detection techniques. And because of this, the accounts evolved and became much more sophisticated than how they were before. So nowadays, we do have bots in our social platforms, but the accounts are not completely automated anymore. So now also automated accounts, they feature a certain degree of human intervention. We have mixed accounts with both human-driven and software-driven behaviors, which are called the cyborgs. And because of this, since there's also some degree of human intervention, they are much more difficult to be detected than how they were before. And then, of course, we also have completely human-driven accounts, which are called trolls. And again, all of these kinds of accounts, bots, cyborgs, and trolls, they are organized in groups typically because they want to have an impact. They want to amplify their effects. And in order to have an impact on a platform with hundreds of millions of users, you have to kind of provide a sort of coordination in your activity, a sort of synchronization. And so they are organized in groups. We have botnets, or we have troll armies, which are controlled typically by an individual entity, which again organizes the behaviors of all these accounts. The point is that now it is much less meaningful to talk about a bot or to talk about a troll or a cyborg. It's much more difficult to understand if an account is fully automated or not. And it's much more difficult to also detect the nature of an account. But is it important to detect the nature? I mean, do we really need to understand if an individual single account is a bot or if it is a troll? Or maybe isn't it better to focus on what these accounts are doing on the social platforms? Well, maybe we should focus on the latter. And that's why in recent years, researchers and also the social platforms themselves are actually focusing on coordinated inauthentic behaviors. So coordinated and inauthentic activities. I talked about the evolution of these accounts, and I would like to mention one very recent important thing that comes into play about the evolution and the complexity of these accounts, which are deepfakes. With the recent advancements in AI, we have a lot of techniques which are based on deep learning for creating texts, images, and videos that are fake, yet very credible. And even humans are not capable of distinguishing between fake texts, fake images and videos, and real ones. And so, even before the rise of deepfakes, we had very sophisticated yet fake accounts. You can just imagine how the situation will look like in 1 year or in 2 years from now, when these accounts will be tweeting and writing text that is algorithmically generated with deepfakes, or having profile pictures that have been algorithmically generated. It already happened. Facebook banned thousands of accounts that were kind of participating in the electoral debate, in the upcoming 2020 US electoral debate, and they all had AI generated profile pictures. And so you can imagine how difficult it will be to distinguish if a single individual account is fake or not. So that's why it is much more useful to kind of switch and see about their behavior, what they do on the platform. One last thing that I would like to mention before stopping is the need for data and the importance of data. So all the detection techniques are trained on some data sets. We need data sets for evaluating the effectiveness of our techniques, but obtaining labeled data where we know in advance which are the bad guys and which are the good ones, or which campaigns have been supported by an inauthentic activity and which instead are about grassroots initiative, authentic grassroots initiatives. Well, it's very difficult. And without this labeled data, it's of course difficult to train algorithms and techniques for detecting them.
Thank you so much, Stefano. This is great. It's all so interesting, and I have so many questions for you, but I will just keep them for the end. So now I'd like to pass it to Seb, who is going to speak a little bit more about some of the indicators and tools and techniques that we have in this field.
Thanks, Carlotta. So back in November of last year, we published a quick overview of some of the key indicators of automation, coordination, and inauthenticity. The crucial aspect to stress is that these indicators only become useful in combination with each other. So in effect, they only tell us something when an account or a group of accounts exhibit a significant number of these indicators. It is also important to note that an account may not be a bot or even use automation software at all. And as Carlotta mentioned, that's not what may be important. Rather, these indicators may suggest that an account or a group of accounts may be inauthentic or coordinated. So in this section, we're going to focus on account, content, and indicators that can be spotted with manual and basic verification techniques. And in the next section, we'll look at network and activity indicators that can be identified with more advanced techniques. Manual observations can be the simplest to make, but can end up actually being the most revealing. So we start off with individual Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. You may have identified one after it amplified or produced a piece of misinformation, or you notice them to be particularly active in the promotion of false or inflammatory narratives. The first and simplest thing you can do to check whether an account may or may not be authentic is to verify their profile information. Of course, certain accounts have very limited information, and some accounts may be private. Some accounts' information can give you clues, such as the profile photo they used. We know, as Stefano mentioned, that pre-existing images are increasingly being used by fake accounts, while thousands of AI-generated images are constantly being produced and are readily available. Other accounts often use random stock images, but this is rarely an indicator. By entering an account's picture in a reverse search engine, you can find whether a picture has appeared somewhere else on the web. This can potentially help you find if other accounts have been using the same picture. Many people, such as our brilliant training and support manager, Laura Garcia, use the same picture across various social media accounts, and this can be the case with generic stock photos. But of course, if a stock photo is being used by different accounts with different personal information, such as different names, then this can be a first indicator suggesting inauthenticity. It's important to note that different search engines use different algorithms and cover different parts of the web, so it's worth trying several of these. For example, Yandex tends to be particularly good with facial pictures. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts can sometimes have their likes mention set as public. Here, it can be useful to look for odd combinations of likes, such as a number of unrelated hyperlocal pages in various countries or languages, or since Facebook likes and Twitter follow lists are presented in the chronological order the account liked them, it can be useful to look for sudden changes in interest towards sensitive or inflammatory topics and sources. This can suggest an account may have been repurposed and may not still be authentic. To check for authenticity and coordination indicators on Facebook pages, a look at the transparency section can be instructive. If If you've noticed certain pages pushing identical content, you may want to check, thanks to this section, whether some of its administrator location information can be found. Some noticeable similarities can suggest, but certainly not prove, common ownership or coordination. Similarly, for Facebook groups, you can often find the creation date, name changes, and administrators in their About section. Of course, a network of coordinated pages and groups may not be inauthentic, but these indicators of coordination may still be interesting, particularly if these communities are pushing out hyper-partisan content or misinformation. In terms of a page's authenticity, it can be useful to look out for name changes that are also identified in this section. If a name appears suspicious due to its contradictory or inconsistent nature, the intent and therefore authenticity of the page may be ambiguous. The Facebook ad library, which the transparency section links to, can also be useful when examining pages' advertisement activity. Look out for ads posted by pages you investigated that were removed as they did not include disclaimer information. This information omission could be an attempt to conceal an identity behind financial support and therefore point to manipulative or inauthentic behavior. The tactics of publishing ads without a disclaimer to attract more followers to pages and in turn more readers to the websites these pages promote has been employed by a number of coordinated and in some instances inauthentic disinformation networks, such as those shown in the slide that were recently uncovered by Le Monde and Politico in collaboration with the EU Disinfo Lab. Looking at the ads detail can also reveal the type of audiences that pages are targeting, and this information can therefore supplement your reporting and your investigations on a network. Online news websites are, of course, key players in the information space and can be created and used as part of inauthentic attempts to steal or profit from already existing content or coordinated efforts to spread disinformation. Finding clues to suggest whether websites are linked with one another can be useful in understanding the tactics used by potentially manipulative actors. As shown in the slides, the use of basic WordPress templates, very high activity rates, name similarities, the common use of social plugins that in fact only redirect to the website itself can provide starting indicators that may warrant further investigations. You can use track blocker extensions such as Ghostery once you're on a website, as shown on the top right of the screen, to reveal a website's use of trackers, which may be useful for further investigation steps. Now, the fact that several websites may be run by one same individual or a group of individuals and used to repurpose content may not be particularly significant in and of itself, but evidence of content repurposing and common ownership can be particularly relevant if these pages are leveraged as part of a wider network of Facebook pages and other social media accounts to push out disinformation, as was the case in 2 cases uncovered by Politico and Le Monde, as mentioned previously. Finally, I would just like to touch on social messaging apps that, as we all know, are playing an increasingly significant role in the context of information disorder. So far, they seem to be attracting relatively little attention for potential automation or manipulation. This may be because they are still one of the newer battlegrounds of disinformation, as Claire Wardle put it, and also because of their more private characteristics. But these apps become a key platform for disseminating and manipulating information. It's important to look out for and develop new indicators that may be specific to these apps. The NATO Stratcom Center, for example, recently published a study on the availability of manipulation services for direct messaging apps, such as WhatsApp and Telegram, that you can find linked at the bottom of the slide. And while they found that manipulation services that are currently readily available for hire online are limited in their sophistication, the range of these services, which includes mass messaging and even access to contact databases, mean actors of a certain level of sophistication can already manipulate audiences through direct messaging apps. So Stefano, beyond these basic indicators, and I mentioned some specific to Twitter accounts, we know you've been working to identify and incorporate advanced indicators, such as more complex patterns of activity and types of content, including the length of tweets, and so on, into automation and inauthenticity modeling. So what do you think are the key advanced indicators that may be more important to identify with more advanced methods?
So I wouldn't say there are a few indicators which convey more information than others. There are, of course, advanced indicators, but what I would suggest here is to try and combine many different ones together, because I think no single indicator, no matter how advanced it could be, how sophisticated, well thought out it could be, no single indicator can provide, the whole story of a coordinated account. So we need to look at the bigger picture, to embrace complexity. It is difficult, it is challenging. Also for us researchers, for us computer scientists that are developing the techniques, it is difficult to model this complexity, but we have to do it. Otherwise, we end up making big mistakes with our techniques. And so one way to try and embrace the complexity of this phenomenon, I think, is by switching from individual indicators, so indicators that are computed out of a single account, for example, or out of a single page, to, let's say, group and collective indicators. So something that gives us an information about how a group behaves. We said before that we are particularly interested in coordinated inauthentic behavior, so coordinated, as we say, that is a key point. And so, can we devise some indicators that help us to measure that coordination? So for example, regarding Twitter accounts, there are many network-based approaches that try to understand if a given group of accounts are all interacting with the same target account or with the same pieces of content, or if they're all interacting with a given hashtag or a given URL, a given domain. So those kind of things, if applied to a large group of accounts, they can reveal traces of coordination. And if that coordination becomes, let's say, very unlikely, also from a statistical point of view, then you could have a red flag for suspicious, for inauthentic coordination. So that's one way to go. And to kind of further walk along this path and try to see the bigger picture, try to embrace complexity and to model, let's say, group behaviors, collective behaviors. One other thing that I consider particularly useful and that I do a lot also in my work is to try and provide visualizations. And for example, visualization that collectively let me see the behavior of a large group of accounts, of a large group of pages. And one key part in using this visualization is that if you notice some peculiar patterns emerging from those visualizations, from those collective views of a behavior, then those peculiar patterns are likely to tell you a story and are likely to reveal the signs of a coordinated activity. Because we also had some scientific results demonstrating that authentic human activity is quite heterogeneous. So not random, but very heterogeneous, while instead those groups that are coordinated, those groups that share a common goal, and they want, for example, to inflate the popularity of a public character, or they want to push a given narrative, they have that common goal, and so they must show some signs of that coordination. And you could, again, by cross-checking several indicators and visualizing them, you could spot some patterns that tell you the story about the coordination of those accounts. So those are two things that I consider to be very, very useful for the future.
Thanks, Stefano. That's really interesting. I'm sure we're also going to have the time to talk about this even more in depth at the end of the webinar.
Yeah.
So right now we'd just like to move on to the next section. So in this section, we're going to present a range of tools and techniques that can be used to identify the presence of automated, coordinated, and/or inauthentic activity indicators. We'll introduce some OSINT tools and techniques, followed by some basic data analysis and investigation methods. And then Carlotta will go through certain computational techniques that can be employed to analyze indicators of coordination around certain topics and narratives. So let's start off with so-called freemium OSINT tools to investigate Twitter accounts. There's a vast number of good tools available to identify content, network, and activity indicators for Twitter accounts. The two of the best ones we found is Twitonomy and Social Bearing. Twitonomy is particularly good for activity indicators as it gives you an instant sample of 3,000 tweets. It displays the proportion of retweets that can give you an indication of automation, as accounts that rely on some degree of automation may be more likely to have an important proportion of their activity as retweets. It also displays the time patterns of tweets, including by hours and days. So for example, here the user does not exhibit a very high number of tweets per day, but if you look on the next slide and you look at the line graph below, you can see they actually regularly post more than 300 tweets per day and appears to take regular interval breaks that may be used in an attempt to not be removed from the platform, for example. We can also spot here on the right the timing of tweets and notes that it doesn't resemble a human activity pattern, as there are no sleep breaks and the only breaks are taken at either 6 AM, 3 PM or 6 PM. Below there's a section that's really useful for network indicators, as you can quickly see the most retweeted users by an account, the users the account mentions most and replies to most. This can lead you to carry out investigations into these accounts to spot potentially similar patterns of activity. So here we move on to social bearing, which can be useful as it offers a quick calculation of the follow to follower ratio. And as many inauthentic accounts depend on mutual follow for follow strategy, a ratio close to 1 can be a useful indicator. Social bearing also gives us a calculation of the tweets per day, but crucially as an average since its creation date, as opposed to from a sample of 3,000 tweets. So in situations such as here, we can see that its tweets per day average differs significantly from the average in the last few days. This could suggest the account may have experienced a notable shift in activity, which can mean it was reappropriated and may not still be authentic. On the left-sided column, we also see the total number of liked tweets from an account, and a very high number can also be an indicator of some degree of automation. Social bearing also provides analysis of the languages used in the account's content, with the presence of several languages, once again providing an additional indicator of inauthenticity. There are many other great tools that can help you identify a network, account, activity and content indicators, which we're going to share with you now in the chat. You can also investigate websites using basic OSINT tools and techniques to determine whether they may be engaging in inauthentic and or be part of a group of connected websites. The first is to simply use an advanced search operator site followed by a source which you suspect a group of connected websites to be taking information from. This will give you approximate results for how often these websites copy and potentially slightly modify content from the same news sources, and therefore provide a further indicator of connection and information manipulation. Important information about websites, such as the IP address of its domain, its creation date, a registrant's name and address, can help us determine whether some websites are coordinating and may be found using easy-to-use free tools such as DNS info. But this information can actually often be redacted as a result of regulation or the use of premium services by domain buyers. So another way to investigate websites and to analyze whether they may be part of a wider coordinated network is to gather information on trackers. So trackers are essentially scripts used on websites in order for a website's publisher to gain information about its visitors. This information can then be monetized in the form of targeted advertisement, for example. Freemium tools such as DNSlytics can help us identify trackers using a given set of websites. There are different types of trackers that websites can use, but we're going to focus on those linked to an advertisement program. They essentially provide website publishers with the ability to display ads on their websites and get financially rewarded. So there are many of these programs, of course, but one of the most popular ones is the Google AdSense. In practical terms, they're pieces of HTML code that publishers embed in their website pages to offer advertisement spaces. Finding the same Google AdSense code on several websites can be a strong indicator that these websites are connected. And this is because each AdSense code can only be linked to an individual account and therefore an individual's financial account. So finding a code used by a website can be done by entering domain names in domain searches as shown in the slide and reverse searching the AdSense code found on the website to find if other websites may in fact be using it. However, it's important that we always double check and cross-reference AdSense information found with these kinds of tools and even advanced website fingerprints tools because for a number of reasons, they can actually reveal inaccurate or outdated AdSense codes for a given set of domain. So as such, it's important to check manually. This can be done by inspecting the website's source code, by entering view source in front of the web address and searching for an AdSense code through the keywords CA-pub. The code will be the string of numbers that follow the letters pub. Of course, these keywords that are used will differ based on the type of tracker that we're looking for. As Stefano mentioned, and also something that we can see through the Facebook's regular announcements of accounts removal, there can often be active coordinated networks of groups and pages on the platform. While the platform publishes removals of what it defines as coordinated inauthentic behavior, it's worth stressing that coordinated behavior may not necessarily be inauthentic, particularly if the groups and pages information and the content they push is consistent. But a useful tool to investigate coordinated networks on Facebook, as well as on other platforms, Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit, is the CrowdTangle link checker tools data function. It's a free extension that can be installed and used by anyone, and it does not require access to CrowdTangle's main platform. It can help you identify whether a given URL link has been shared by several groups and pages in an extremely short period of time. A recent study on coordinated link sharing from the University of Urbino defined this time frame as 10 to 23 seconds, depending on the data set. This can serve as an indicator that may suggest that groups of pages are coordinating, but it's important to note that this is just one indicator and does not mean anything by itself. The indicator should be demonstrated by the same groups and pages for many links shared, and these pages and groups should also exhibit a number of other indicators before we can suggest that they are coordinated. So as we've shown on the slide, once you're on a link, you can open the extension and click the download button. Once you've imported the CSV file and you've cleaned the data, you can format the dates column and sort your sheets by date, so the timestamps of the shares will appear chronologically, and you can start looking for simultaneous shares. If the data set is large, it can be helpful, of course, to filter it down. For example, you can filter down by focusing only on pages, by taking out rows with links from groups. So once this is done, the data should look something like this. And if the data set is very small, such as this one, you can manually look at the timestamps and identify whether certain shares are extremely close to one another. But otherwise, you can split the date data based on hours and then create a pivot table and generate the number of times a link was shared within each hour. So by displaying these in descending order, we can therefore observe if there were particular hours within which the link was shared a lot. We can then go back to our data and filter it to contain shares from those hours only to reduce the quantity of data and start looking within it. If the data set is particularly large, we can repeat this process by obtaining the count of shares on the day or even minute. Additionally, you can then create new sheets and import data for the same link, but for its shares on Twitter, Reddit, and Instagram, and then cross-reference that data to see if the link was shared simultaneously on several platforms. And of course, this can serve as an indicator that a user or several users are coordinated across platforms. Finally, for those who have access to the CrowdTangle main platform, you can use the intelligence function, which you can find at the top right next to the live display tool. This function gives you the possibility to analyze both individual pages and groups and lists of several pages and groups. So for example, if you wanted to look for further indicators of whether certain pages and groups were coordinated, you could input them in a list in your dashboard and then carry out an analysis on their activity using this intelligence function. So here, for example, you can focus on an indicator of activity, such as post count, and compare each page's post count and notice whether their post patterns seem to converge at a specific time or for an extended period of time. We'd just like to provide you the link to FirstDraft's basic and advanced toolkits, where you can find more useful verification and OSINT tools that can assist you further when investigating for these kinds of indicators. And we're also going to send you some links to some other great toolkits that are publicly available. So now I'm going to pass on to Carlotta, who's going to demonstrate how certain computational techniques can be employed to carry out analyses on the extent to which a given topic or conversation may have been manipulated or not.
Yes, so at first draft, we use some data scraping and analysis tools to look at some of the indicators that were explained before. So in this way, we can look at the data as a whole, and if we see a particular number of patterns in a specific sequences, then it's more likely to be coordinated. So there are several tools and approaches that you can take and that we take, but these are the easiest one that we use. And if you have some basic data knowledge, they're not hard at all to use. So we will share some links and resources afterwards to show how you can use them and give you some tutorials. So they all have some pros and cons. For example, you can use the Python TweetPy to scrape data from the Twitter API, but you can only get data that goes back for a week. But on the other side, you can get pretty comprehensive data. So you can either stream data as they happen, or search. You can search either by hashtag, by account, and you can retrieve a lot of very useful information about the account, as well as tweets and retweets all together. With tweets, on the other side, you can get all data back to pretty much any time, but there are some limitations. So for example, you have to scrape tweets and retweets separately. You don't get as much information as you do with the API, but you can do many things. You can also write a function, for example, to scrape a list of accounts altogether, which might be really helpful in this case. And then CrowdTangle again, which is a Facebook tool to download, where you can download Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit data based on a set of keywords and safe searches that you have and a list of accounts. And we also have some tutorials on First Draft that you can use as a guide. So in the next slide, we see the CSV as it comes, which has several interesting fields and columns. Like you retrieve a lot of info about the account, like for example, the account description, which is really useful, the account creation date, which is also really useful in these fields. You get the followers count, followers, friends, location, when it's allowed, a lot of information. So after you download the data, you can apply a set of different analyses on your data. I'm just gonna show you very quickly some of the stuff that we did at First Draft. So this is the first one, the pattern of activity, because as my colleague said, a high rate of activity is typically the first indicator of inauthenticity. And as they said, however, it's really difficult to agree on fixed benchmarks. And it's really important for you to focus on the different communities, the different set of accounts that you're looking at. Because, for example, if you're looking at a community of journalists, it's much more likely that they post more frequently than other communities. And they may appear as bot-like. In this example, we scraped tweets mentioning the Surrender Bill, Surrender Act hashtags that were trending in the UK last fall. About Brexit, and we calculated how many times per day accounts in the dataset were tweeting. So like that, you can quickly look at the top accounts for suspicious activity. This other example, you can extract hashtags, you can extract mentions, links, any potentially divisive and hyper-partisan words within the account description, and this could tell us a lot about the network that we are looking at. So in this example, this is steal from the same dataset of before, and we scraped from the Twitter bios of the accounts posting Surrender Bill. And as you can notice, the high incidence of MAGA, Make American Great Again, is higher than Back Boris or Make Britain Great Again, as well as the presence of reference to like QAnon narrative and other conspiracy theory. Another indicator is the account's creation date. So if they were created recently, just in the last year or few months, this could be used to flag suspicious activity. But that's not so straightforward. At the same time, for example, if an account with an early creation date, which lays dormant and then exhibits a sudden spike in activity, this could also be an indicator of suspicious activity. So this graph, for example, was from the general election campaign, when with First Draft, we were looking at thousands of retweets of a specific Boris Johnson tweet, along with the two hashtags, Get Brexit Done and Take Back Control. And the retweets produced by many accounts that were created in the previous month, so in September, as you can see in the graph. And in the following slide, we have a similar example that was from Bolivia, where after the President Evo Morales' resignation in last November, thousands of Twitter accounts start posting the message, in Bolivia there was no coup, in both Spanish and English. And that was an apparent attempt to change narrative. So of all the almost 70,000 accounts posting there was no coup, First Draft found that nearly 30% were created in November, which was the same month, and nearly 5,000 were created on the 11th, which was the day after the Morales resignation. So again, were they bots? Were they automated? A large number of brand new accounts could certainly suggest some suspicious activity, but only a single indicator was not enough to jump to any conclusion. Another example that I wanted to show you was on Facebook. So during the UK election campaign, we also looked at Facebook because Boris Johnson posts were immediately followed by hundreds of Facebook comments, all saying the same things, the same approving comments, such as brilliant Boris, fantastic, so on. We also seen multiple examples of a message that looks like a coding error, like the one on the bottom right. So we analyzed the comments, and more than 30% contain the word brilliant only. And this is an example that shows clear signs of inauthenticity, with some experts suggesting that the people in the comments were paid activists or automated accounts, presumably manipulating algorithms in order to promote that particular content. It was also being explained as Brexit enthusiasts who have signed up for some services that automatically like and comment Boris Johnson post. It was difficult to ascertain exactly whether it was a coordinated traffic manipulation or inauthentic, but even assuming it was organic, such a large percentage of repetitive phrases or bot-like behavior was alarming on its own. So now I wanted to pass it to Stefano, who will tell us a little bit more the advanced stuff that you can do when you analyze this data together as networks. And he's going to explain some of the many trade-offs that we face when dealing with these metrics and with these automated tools. Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you, Carlotta. Yeah, well, actually, there have been hundreds of bot detectors proposed in the last years. As I said, it's like 10 years that we're studying these things, so a lot of time to come up with different techniques for spotting bots. I'm focusing specifically on bots because that's one of the longest studied topics, while instead coordination and inauthenticity, they came out recently. I think it was 2018 when Facebook introduced for the first time the notion of coordinated inauthentic behavior. So academia is quite slow, as you know, in dealing with these changes. We take time, and so there are not many tools out there, not many techniques for spotting coordinated inauthentic behaviors. We actually don't even know exactly what that is. So we, of course, cannot easily devise strategies for detecting that. But instead, for bots, they've been studied a lot. So all these indicators that we talked about in the webinar, they can be plugged into, for example, a machine learning algorithm, like a classification algorithm, and provided a labeled data set, as I said before, we can kind of teach the algorithm to classify accounts as either bots or not. As we said, binary classifications are not very informative as of today. We would need something more fuzzy, let's say. And there are tools that actually do this. So many of you, I think, are already familiar with Botometer, which is the most widely known, most widely used bot detection technique out there. It has been released, first released in 2014, but it has been updated several times. And for example, Botometer outputs a bot score, which ranges from 0 to 1, which can be used as a, let's say, a further, very sophisticated indicator of whether an account is automated or not. And just to give you an idea of how complex these machine learning tools are, Botometer actually uses 1,200 different features, so 1,200 different individual indicators about an account to classify it as automated or not, okay? So this is an example, let's say a computational example of how to combine different indicators into a single label, a single classification output. But despite all of these indicators, so despite all of the information that Botometer uses, it still makes mistakes. And in fact, there have been quite a bit of criticism recently about the accuracy, the reliability of bot detection algorithms. And regarding this, I would like to talk about a couple of trade-offs that we face when using and when also developing machine learning AI-driven bot detection techniques. So one first important trade-offs is the trade-off between the possibility to conveniently use a detection system and the accuracy of that system. I'm thinking about journalists, social and political scientists, so non-technicians, let's say, which ideally would want and would greatly benefit from a simple, easy to use tool such as Botometer, which has a web interface and the Python API. So it's very easy to use, let's say, even if you are not a coder. But we have to be aware that simplicity typically means that the system is not state of the art. And so we kind of trade simplicity for accuracy, okay? So it's very difficult that a state-of-the-art, sophisticated bot detection or coordination detection or inauthenticity detection technique, you name it, it's the same for each of these things. If it is extremely easy to use, then chances are it doesn't perform extremely sophisticated analysis. And so we have to take the results with a grain of salt, okay? Another trade-off, which is similar to this one, is about the amount of data that is needed for performing the analysis. So as we said before, we could try to classify accounts by watching them, by analyzing them individually, or we could try to look at the bigger picture, try and analyze the collective behavior of a community, of a large group of accounts, which of course demands much more data for the analysis, and also much more time for running, for example, sophisticated algorithms. So if you want a tool that can give you let's say an answer in a matter of some minutes, then you cannot perform extremely complicated analysis, of course. And some kinds of network analysis, like cross-checking the interactions between different groups, so on and so forth, they actually require quite a bit of time and quite a bit of data. So again, we have to be aware that if we want something that we can use very easily, which provides very quick answers, then that's not much sophisticated. And then again, another important thing that we should mention is that we say that there exist different types of accounts. We talked about bots, cyborgs, trolls, so on and so forth. There's also exist many different kinds of malicious activities that can be performed online. So as I said, you can try to push a narrative by mass retweeting messages by a given politician, or you could post URLs pointing to certain domains, or you can favorite some other content, so on and so forth. And different detection techniques that have been proposed, they are targeted to different behaviors. So if you use a given technique which is devised for spotting mass retweets, to try and classify accounts that do not retweet, but they do something else, like, I don't know, spamming URLs, then that technique will likely not work, at least not as you expect. So we have to be careful of using the right tool for the right situation. We should have an idea in advance about what kind of malicious behavior we're trying to spot, what could go wrong, and what we would want to highlight. And then we should ask ourselves, what is the correct way of trying and making that behavior emerge? Okay, so different techniques have different characteristics, and we should try to use the right tools. Nothing else comes to my mind, so I think I can conclude this session.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Stefano. And actually, I can just notice that we're almost out of time, but just like to hand over to Alastair if there's any questions from the audience that we could answer.
Yes, thank you very much, Seb and Stefano and Carlos, for such an excellent run through of all your some of your recent work. I think the first time I heard Stefano speak was a kind of, oh my God, I don't know anything about this subject moment, when I thought I knew more than I did. And it's always great to hear Carlotta and Seb give updates on all the work that they do and the new tools and techniques which they seem to find on a daily basis. So I hope that was as interesting for me as it was to everyone else. We do have some questions coming in. I think as we started a little bit later than 4 o'clock, we can go on a little bit later than 5 o'clock if everybody's happy for that. Not for a long time, but just for some of the questions. One of them that I was going to put in at the top was, would you be able to point to any resources on issues of attribution in disinformation campaigns? Now, before I hand over to the panelists, I'm going to point to one thing which we had a hand in recently from the Stanford Internet Observatory, who launched a project. I'll put a link, just that's not transferred properly. Put a link in there about a new project, an initiative to better help journalists and anyone really to be able to understand and identify where some of this behavior comes from. So I highly recommend reading that. But Seb, Stefano, Carlos, are there any things or resources that spring to mind when it comes to issues of attribution and saying where a lot of this comes from, or the difficulties that arise from trying to do that?
Well, surely regarding the difficulties, I'm used to work with the data that is publicly available. So I kind of can only exploit the kind of information that is clearly visible on Twitter, for example, or on Facebook. And trying to solve the problem of attribution with publicly available data, in my point of view, is extremely difficult. So that's something that is very challenging. Researchers have been trying to do this for quite some time with, let's say, quite limited results. That is a well-known problem in the security field also. So also attribution about let's say intrusion attacks to networks, to computer systems, that kind of stuff. It's very difficult. And so I actually don't have an interesting answer to the first question.
Yeah, in obviously attribution, just to echo what Stefano said, is one of the most difficult things. And obviously as researchers, we don't have the same access to the kinds of information that could potentially help us do that than, of course, the platform themselves. And that's also one of the reasons why it's incredibly important to not overstate whether something might be inauthentic or not, because of course to not have any kind of reliable data on how we could attribute an account to a certain person or to a certain organization means that it's very difficult to tell whether something is in fact authentic or not. And that's something that the problems with attribution and attribution methodology in data, something that seems to be a problem for a lot of organizations, even those, for example, working during the 2016 or after the 2016 US elections, to look at potentially inauthentic activity coming from foreign actors. Actually, a lot of them said that they didn't receive some of the details and some of the attribution methodology that was given to them from the platforms. So it's a significant issue for sure.
You're on mute, Alastair.
I can try and be professional in these things. It's something which happens every single time to everyone, I'm sure. Thank you, Carlotta. I was just saying, yeah, it is a constant struggle, it seems. And as Stefano said at the beginning, one that will be aided with better access to data. I think is something that seems to come up again and again whenever I speak to people and hear people talk about this issue. A question from Dan here, who says, this has been amazing. Do you have any tutorials teaching people how to scrape data, whether that's with R, Python, machine learning tools, etc.? Are there any things people would recommend?
I don't have anything specific in mind right now, but there are a lot of resources online. So I don't know if we can also add some links, Alastair, to the published version online of this webinar. So maybe people can also find these kind of things.
Yes, we can certainly add some in there when we publish the resources on the webinar page. I imagine Carlos has got some in mind as well.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that there are a lot of tutorials to use these programming languages for access social media data. We can recommend a few, and we also published a couple of guides to scrape and clean and make data ready to be analyzed on the First Draft website. So we're going to share all of these links with you afterwards.
Another question that came in, this is slightly off topic, but is increasingly something that people are talking about. Someone asked, apart from a handful of situations, have we seen any fake news using deep fakes? It was mentioned at the start and is obviously talked about a lot, but what's your take on that, guys?
Well, I think that's still a problem in its infancy, which, however, is about to grow. I know that there are some Twitter accounts that are tweeting with deepfake texts. So they have a text generation neural language models attached to them. And it is also possible to kind of personalize the style, the writing style of a given piece of text in order to basically make the account convey the same message but with a different style. And with a kind of personalization. So they are out there. I have colleagues that are studying these kind of accounts right now. And so it would be interesting to see how this goes. And I also know about some first preliminary works that kind of trained AI architectures for spotting AI-generated fake news. So AI-generated news articles, let's say. So I still don't know how much of these deep fake news, we could call them, are actually out there, but I expect that to increase in the near future. And just one other tiny thing that comes to my mind is that imagine the effort that it takes to fact check a news, and imagine the effort, the negligible effort that it takes for an AI system, for a trained AI system to mass produce deep fake news. So we have a very uneven situation here, where mass producing fake news propaganda with these AI techniques has a negligible cost, while instead fact checking them might require a much bigger cost. So we are in a kind of disadvantage here, I think.
It seems like so-called shallow fakes that kind of edit parts of speech, for example, tend to be much more prevalent, at least at the moment. And it does look like there is still quite a significant cost of entry for people wanting to develop those kinds of content. And whilst it is democratizing, it maybe hasn't democratized to the extent that maybe many thought it would. Personally, having focused a lot recently on the French online information ecosystem, I did spot a couple of YouTube channels that used sort of deepfake videos that didn't really get any traction, and actually it was also spotted by some media organizations that actually chose not to respond or report on it because the quality wasn't that good. And then that's actually a couple of examples of kind of the only examples, and those that used better technology or that produced a better end product in the end. So yeah, I think text and potentially types of shallow fake for the moment might be more prevalent.
Hi everyone, we have 5 minutes left in today's webinar. Before we take our last question, I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today. Your feedback is valuable to us, and I'm going to add our feedback survey to the chat box. We ask that you take just 2 minutes to complete this. Thank you for today.
Thank you very much, Jen. Yeah, we would really appreciate your feedback because the only way we know how to make these better and more useful to our audiences is by asking. So please, if you do have a spare few minutes to fill out that form, we'd really, really appreciate it. The last question, I think, to offer up to the team, to the panel, is regarding, there was a little discussion earlier about networks and a little mention of data visualizations, and there's a question come in, and I know this is something Carlotta, you and we've talked about a little bit, you know more about than I do, but about the networks that have been discussed here a little bit, and visualizing that, and any recommendations both for being able to get started in trying to identify those and do that visualization, but also any difficulties, perhaps for the rest of the panel, what difficulties there are in identifying those networks. So how do you start? How do you visualize it? And what are the challenges?
So the first challenge is getting the data, because when we talk about network analysis, we of course talk about a lot of data. And so that's a first drawback, especially if you have to cope with the rate limits of, for example, Twitter APIs and that kind of stuff that can get quite time consuming. I personally, I'm a computer scientist, so I personally like to analyze networks in Python and R. So NetworkX or iGraph are two exceptional libraries that kind of enable all kinds of network analysis. But also Gephi, of course, is an interesting tool for performing analysis and also for visualizing stuff. And then, of course, for visualizing, again, both Python and R have a huge number of libraries for plotting things like ggplot or Seaborn, Matplotlib in Python. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And another tiny suggestion that I would like to give is that I personally find much more useful interaction networks with respect to social networks. So I think they convey much more information. So as a starting point, I would suggest to go that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to add up on this, saying that, yeah, so I love data visualizations most of the times, but they have to add something and communicate the data that you're trying to explain in a simple and easy way to tell. And sometimes with networks with visualization, you might end up with these networks that, in spite of their beauty, might seem not to tell that much of interest about your data. So I think that's the crucial point about network visualizations, whether they actually say something, they add something, or they're just too complicated to add some information about the specific piece of information that you're trying to tell.
100%. Thank you, Carlotta. And thank you, Seb and Stefano, as well. Keep an eye out on the First Draft website in the coming weeks, where we hope to publish an article on exactly this topic, on how to go about identifying networks, visualizing networks, and some of the things which we need to bear in mind when doing that kind of work. As I mentioned before, if you do have 2 minutes to fill in the form, which Jen thankfully posted in the chat there, then we would be incredibly grateful to hear your feedback. And we will be posting all the resources and the video from the webinar on the First Draft website, where you can find all the other recent webinars and the upcoming ones as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you all so much to the panelists for sharing your insight and expertise. And I hope you all stay safe and have a good evening.